Today we're going to be working on mistakes, okay? When there's any time data is collected and analyzed, there's always got to be room for error, right? When conclusions are drawn from data, typically if they're done in a sound fashion, right? They're collected, the data is collected properly, they're analyzed properly, we use the right test, we use the right significance levels. Usually the answer is correct. The data tells us like what conclusion to make, and that conclusion is sound. But there are also sometimes where mistakes can happen, right? Where the data tells us one thing, but the truth is actually something else. All right, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So when we talk about hypothesis testing, okay, first let me go back. Our objective is to be able to explain what a type 1 and a type 2 error are in tests of significance or hypothesis tests in the context of a problem. So we have two correct decisions, right? We reject the null hypothesis when the null hypothesis is false, and you should reject the null. Okay. There's also when you don't reject the null hypothesis and it was true, which means you shouldn't have rejected it, which is also a good decision. All right. But there are two different mistakes that can be made as well. The first is called a type 1 error. We use Roman numerals to describe them. All right. Your type 1 error is when you reject the null hypothesis, but it was true and you should not have rejected the null. A type 2 error is when you do not reject the null and it was false and you should have rejected the null. All right. So if you reject it when you should not have, you made a type 1 error. If you don't reject it when you should have, you made a type 2 error. And I made a note here that you always need to make sure you do this in the context of the problem. Okay, when you're describing them, like when you get a situation, we're going to go through a ton of examples right now. So when you have an example, if you just write this, you told me the definition, which is not the error for that problem. Okay, you just regurgitated a definition, which is different than what we're looking for. Okay, so before we get into math type problems, let's go through two real life problems. So the first is a court case. All right, if I give you that the null hypothesis is that the defendant is innocent, and the alternate hypothesis is that the defendant is not innocent or guilty, you could think, right? If we want to describe what the errors are, I find that it's helpful for students, okay? Like if we first go through our correct decisions, all right, which you don't have to do normally, but I want to just break them down for you. You'll notice that the top line I wrote in blue, where it's like the definition. And then in the bottom, I wrote in black what it is in the context of the problem. Okay, so correct decisions are you reject the null hypothesis when the null hypothesis is false, which is saying they're not innocent when they really aren't innocent. The second is when you get do not reject the null when the null is true, right? Which is what you should have done, right? Which means you're concluding they're innocent and they really were innocent. So these are two correct decisions. So now, as we go through, okay, we can also have incorrect decisions. So a type 1 error. Now you're not required to write the definition, but I think it's helpful sometimes for people to write the definition so that you have like a way you can just like kind of plug in underneath what it is. Okay, so type 1 error is you reject the null hypothesis, which means you reject the null and you say the defendant, you conclude the defendant is not innocent, but the null was true, which meant they really were innocent. So you're deciding or concluding that the defendant is not innocent when they were. That's an error. Okay, that would be declaring someone's guilty in a trial, but they really were innocent. The other error, okay, and you'll notice it's fail to reject. So instead of writing do not reject, another thing we can write is fail to reject the null. Now, typically this isn't an open notes year, right? And you just need to know your content. So when it's not open notes, what I typically do is I write, instead of fail to reject, I write fail to reject the null because it's a type 2 error, and I say fail to reject the null. It's just a nice little gimmick to help me remember. Okay, so if we fail to reject the null or do not reject the null when the null is false, then that would mean what? If you don't reject the null, you're deciding that the defendant is innocent, but the null was false, which meant the defendant really wasn't innocent. So decide the defendant is innocent when they really weren't innocent. Okay, it matters if you get these backwards. All right, so a type 1 error would be this, a type 2 error would be this. Okay, so let's do a couple more. We're gonna do a bunch. So now what I want to just do is if we're talking about jumping in a pool, all right, we're not going to go through the correct decisions. We're just going to go through what it would mean to have the two errors, like what they would be in the context of the problem. So a type 1 error would be reject the null when the null is true. Okay, so if you're jumping in a pool, if our null hypothesis is it's full of water, right? Let's say you're blindfolded and you can't see the water and you're just deciding, am I going to jump or am I not going to jump? Okay, well, there's very different situations that could happen if the pool is full or if the pool is empty. All right, so if we have a type 1 error, reject the null when the null is true. If you reject the null, that means you're saying it's not full, but it really was full. So if you conclude the pool is not full, which means it's empty, and it was full, this means you don't jump. Right? Because if it's not full, if you decide it's not full, it's empty, then you're not going to jump when it really was full and you should have jumped. You made an error because you missed out on a lovely day of swimming. Okay? Whereas for a type 2 error, if you fail to reject the null when the null is false, if you fail to reject, that means you're going to conclude, if you don't reject the null, you're going to conclude that the pool is full of water, but it's false and it really isn't full of water. So conclude the pool is full of water when it really is empty. So you're going to say it's full. You're blindfolded. You're like, it's full. I'm jumping in. But it was empty. So you should not have jumped. Right? Now you have it. This is also an error. This error happens to be way more drastic than this error. This error, type 1 error, you missed out on a lovely day of swimming. This error, you just jumped into an empty pool and now you have lots of problems. Okay? Now, they are like generic examples. Now let's talk about it with math, right? And as we go through our different situations. So what we want to do is we want to, for each scenario stated below, we want to determine the null and the alternate hypotheses. We want to state what our type 1 and type 2 errors are. It's always in the context of the problem. N-T-E-X-T. Always in the context of the problem. And we want to describe the consequences of each. Okay, so true data back on February 24th of 2014, so 7 years ago, gas was insanely expensive. It actually got to $4 a gallon that year. So we are pretty lucky right now. So it was $3.42 per gallon 7 years ago. If a sample is taken of New Jersey gas prices on that date, can we support the theory that we paid less for a gas a gallon? This is also before now we have extra taxes and it's like 20 cents a gallon. So ours would actually be 20 cents cheaper when we compare it to this. New Jersey had really cheap gas compared to the national average. So first we need to state our hypotheses. So we're saying, right, null, mu is equal to this. Alternate mu is less than because we paid less. All right. So type 1, if you need, right, if you find it helpful, you can write the definition down before you plug in the context. But remember, this is not the answer. What I'm about to show you is the answer. Now, maybe you try this on your own, right? So some people find it helpful to write this down and then plug stuff in underneath. Some people can go straight to the answer. If you reject the null, right, it means you're concluding this, but this was true. So you're concluding New Jersey gas is less than 342 when it is really equal to the 342. This would be a consequence, right? So consequences, like people from Pennsylvania and Delaware would come over the bridge. They would pay the tolls for the bridge to buy gas in New Jersey because it would be so much cheaper, and then they would drive back over the bridge. So if New Jersey claims and decide, if the conclusion is New Jersey has cheaper gas, but really we're equal to the average, people are going to come across the bridge but they shouldn't have, because they're paying what we were going to pay anyway. Okay, they would have paid probably what they would have paid in their own state. Type 2 error. You failed to reject the null when the null was false. Okay, and you should have rejected it. So you conclude that New Jersey gas costs $3.419, which is average, when it was less than that. This would be an error because the gas stations would lose out on money, right? If people don't think gas is cheaper, yeah, that's nice for us New Jersey residents. Right now we don't have a big problem of people coming in. But for here, right, if they have, like the gas stations, the owners, they would miss out on a lot of customers potentially, because you don't think that New Jersey has cheaper gas, so people won't come buy it from there, and then we'd have a problem. Okay, so hopefully you wrote down those consequences as well, right? You could maybe have another consequence. There's other situations that could work, all right? So if we go through this example, all right, a sub sandwich company claims that their shorty hoagie is 6 inches long. A frequent customer believes that the average length of the subs is actually less than that. So, right, you remember how Subway had that big lawsuit where someone said your 6-inch hoagie is not really 6 inches, and the person won because the rolls were being cut, the rolls were being made smaller than what the company was advertising. It was like half a foot or foot long. I think it was foot long. So it was 12 inches, and they were proven mathematically that they were actually less than 12 inches. So if we go with 6 inches, right, we would have mu equals 6, mu is less than 6. Just a coincidence that both examples were less than. It could be either way, all right? So right now you should be trying these on your own, okay? So try this on your own. Type 1 error. You reject the null when the null is true. So how would you write that in the context of the problem? Decide that the sub is less than 6 inches when it is really 6 inches. What would a consequence be? Like for the company. Now people are saying, hey, you're not giving us the product we bought, right? They're deciding the company is doing a bad job, but really the company was just fine in making the sandwiches as long as they claimed they were. That's a problem, right? The company was found to be lying, and the company wasn't liars. Type 2 error. Fail to reject the null when the null is false, which means you decide the subs are 6 inches when they are really less than 6. This is an error in the favor of the company. This is against the customer, right? That says the company's doing just fine, but really the company isn't giving you the product you buy. This is an error for the customer. All right. So you guys try number 5 on your own. A company claims to be able to increase a person's credit score by more than 40 points over the course of the year. So raising your credit score by 40 points is significant. This is big. This is good, right? The higher your credit score, the better it is for the person. So if a company is saying I'm going to be able to raise your credit score, all right, you've got your hypotheses. Now pause it. Try to write out your type 1 and your type 2 error. Genuinely try it. I know that I can't see you right now, but that's how you get better, is when you actually practice and then you know what questions you have. All right. A type 1 error would be deciding the company increases your score by more than 40 points when they really don't. This is false advertising. Okay. The customers think that they're going to get something and they're really not, and that's a problem for the customers. All right. A type 2 error. Okay. Deciding the company doesn't increase the credit score by more than 40 points when they really do. That's a problem for the company. The company is going to lose customers. People won't use them when really the company would have done a good job and sold, raised your credit score and have done well with that. All right. So that's our lesson for type 1, type 2 errors. We will, of course, practice, and I will see you soon.